Hi, this is Dan, and let's talk about the results of the Writers Guild strike from last year. The Writers Guild, after much delay, has finally come out with their reports on what income earnings were like this past year. Surprise, surprise, the results were not good. In fact, they were down well over 30% from last year, year over year. And I know that it's very easy to look at that and say, well, of course that's going to happen because the Writers Guild strike went on for a very long time. So obviously it was going to have a deleterious effect on their overall earnings for this past year. That part is basically true, but let's not forget something else, and that is that the Writers Guild was supposedly going to get writers a lot more money for the work that they are doing. And in fact, we have seen it go exactly the opposite direction. It's not all bad news because there's always unintended consequences. And this wasn't my first time at a Writers Guild rodeo. Even though I've never been a member of the Writers Guild, I was always in management in one form or another, whether I was a script reader, whether I was a director of development, whether I was a vice president of development at the company now known as Fremantle Media. I did go through 3 name changes of that company before they finally succeeded in prying me out. I've been out of there for a while now, but I still maintain a lot of my contacts from those years within the entertainment industry, which is why I feel I can still speak on a lot of this. Let's talk about some of the previous Writers Guild incidents that happened. In 1988, there was an extremely long strike that went on. The result of that strike was that the home video, especially non-union oriented home video, became even more powerful than it had been in the past. And while that eventually had a big plus for the writers, because at the same time, you started having bigger and bigger budgets done through those companies that were originally based on home video. Let's look specifically at a company like Carolco or some of the ones that were doing artistic films, such as Island Alive and DEG and all of that, some of which made some of the greatest movies of the 80s and knew how to leverage a lower budget into something that would have a good return on investment. Now, they wouldn't make the kind of spectacular money that, let's say, some of the breakout hits like a Terminator 2 or a Dirty Dancing or a Platoon would make, but they would return very handsome investments because of judicious packaging, of judicious business procedures. That all blew up, not because of the writers, but because of people getting the idea that you didn't have to bother about what the quality was, that you could lay off X number of titles for X percentage of the budget, and there's no way you could lose money. Doesn't that sound familiar? Because it did happen again, right? It happened with streaming. So, plus ça change, c'est plus la même chose, as they say in murdered French, right? The more things change, the more they stay the same. So, in the late 90s, what we saw during a period when ABC had just been bought by Disney. So the entire network world was in a turmoil because it looked like you were going to have the studios come in and the big producers, the Norman Lears of the world, the Linda Bloodworth Thomases, the Susan Harrises, all of these, all Carsey Warners, all of these really big companies were now faced with losing their leverage because under the ownership of the studios of the networks, they started insisting that their own projects get sold. Now, this strike went on for quite a while too, because this was trying to make up for shortfalls in home video, as well as the massive amounts of money that was starting to pour in from original content being done on the HBOs and Showtimes of the world, because they were getting the taste of just how lucrative doing adult-oriented shows without a lot of advertisements in the middle of it could be for the premium channels. And this was also trickling down at this point into first-run syndication, which was still somewhat robust because even though UPN had started and the WB had started, and so a lot of the real estate that had been available for a show like a Baywatch back in the early 90s was no longer there. So you were starting to see that go away, but basic cable was more or less picking up the slack. Well, that Writers Guild strike ended up running a long time as well. And in the process of that, there was a big gap in programming for the next year, because this was before linear TV was starting to decrease in its impact. And so what happened? You're right. Game shows, prime time, which for some reason, even though the biggest shows in access, the 7 to 8 p.m. period that was supposed to be for community-oriented programming, but it instead become the home of the top rerun shows like Friends and Seinfeld, or game shows like Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, which had been in those slots since the early 80s. So they held on to them like bulldogs and were getting sensational numbers out of them that newer shows couldn't get. Newer first-run syndication game shows could not get. But what started happening was, you started, because of Millionaire, you started having prime time network game shows. For some reason, since the early 70s, that had been considered verboten, that people wouldn't watch game shows after 8 p.m., I guess. And so What's My Lines and all of those shows, to tell the truth, had disappeared. And so had some of the evening, more event-oriented programming, the news shows. I mean, yes, you had your news magazines, but not so much. So again, you had this influx of content that wasn't necessarily union that was coming in, and that was added onto the number of documentaries and courtroom shows and all of that were dominating cable. So again, you had a problem. So what happened on this most recent strike, the win that the unions claimed was their big victory, was, of course, that they were able to ensure that there would be no AI being used on writing, which, as some wags pointed out, was part of the original Writers Guild agreements that had come through in the 1930s, which, using legalese, had said that the writer had to be a natural person who was a member of the Writers Guild, and those were the only people that could be employed to create content that the studios who were signatories could make. That ruled out AI from the very beginning. So for anyone who had been in the business and had seen these strikes before, said, wait a minute, there's something rotten in Denmark here, because this part's already protected. Yeah, actors were a little bit under the gun because there were other things from the past that had been allowed through, such as having dummies as extras and all of that. But you still didn't have that kind of direct, you can't use that person's face and image. And again, this isn't going to refer to the big stars. It's only going to refer to the incomers and the smaller players. Well, all of this action took attention away from the real problem that premium streaming had. And that was, you didn't have a lot of episodes. You didn't have a rerun structure anymore. In their quest to be au courant and very, very fashionable, what streaming services and the investment capital that behind it had done was effectively destroy the Windows systems, where you used to have multiple windows of distribution for a project to go through over time. For example, for a network series that had, let's say, over 5 years, so you have over 100 episodes, and you really didn't want to have a lot more than that unless it was a Seinfeld or Friends or something that was strategically important, because then you start having too many episodes, especially if you're a producer and you're deficit financing them, because that means that until you are in rerun land, you're taking enormous deficits on a yearly basis because you're covering part of the cost of production. So if you have 200 episodes, That means once it starts rerunning on a daily basis, you're going to run approximately 200 slots during the course of a year. And it normally takes at least 2 runs to make up for a deficit that you might have had. Now, Baywatch was a different story because Baywatch was in profits from the time it aired the first time, because the money 100% for the cost of production was coming out of its European partners. That was not a common business deal. That's why Baywatch was able to stay on for so long, because it didn't need the same numbers that other shows had. Anyway, what would happen in many instances is you'd have a show that has way too many episodes. Let's say the show ran for 10 years. Now you end up having about 200 episodes. Well, what happens when you're rerunning those once a day? That means you air the show once during that year, not twice. So therefore, it's going to take you 2 years to cycle through to profitability. Now, if your show was a Friends or a Seinfeld, that's a beautiful thing, because that show runs forever. Mary Tyler Moore Show ran forever. Okay, maybe not recently until MeTV and all that, but it ran for over 10 years as a rerun, almost 20 years as a rerun. Shows like MASH ran 30 years as reruns on really heavy rotation bases. So they were licenses to print money. Well, what's the difference with streaming? With streaming, the challenge is you're starting with 10 to 12 episodes, sometimes less. So that means you're probably not going to have a vast number of episodes quickly. Moreover, because it's not aired every week for a big chunk of the year, especially if you have that few episodes, and especially in the early days when they were running them all as binge viewing, so it would the entire series would drop at the same time. But that meant that you would have between a year and a half until it dropped again. So you would go most of the year without getting reinforced that you loved that show, right? And the same thing was happening with rerunning it, because most of those shows were longer form dramas which had cliffhangers. Now, there's a danger with cliffhangers in the world of reruns. And the danger with cliffhangers in the world of reruns is that when you run something that has a cliffhanger, once people know what the solution of that cliffhanger is, in a rerun situation, you might not be that interested in seeing it again, because you might not have liked what happened as a result of the cliffhanger. Remember that Game of Thrones and Sopranos, 2 of the biggest hits that were ever on premium cable, ended with bad last episodes. Or in the case of Game of Thrones, a whole bad last season. So that meant you kind of burn down your ability to rerun or repackage or bring it back. Now, in the case of Game of Thrones, House of Dragon came in just at the right time. It came in before people could get over how much they had loved Game of Thrones. And it was good enough to where people will now joke about how bad the last season was of the initial run, but they don't hold it against the future episodes. So that worked fine. Unfortunately, in the case of Sopranos, leaving it with that open end, did Tony get killed? Did it just stop for whatever cockamamie reason? So by the time they were really seriously, because they pissed people off, by the time they seriously considered either doing a sequel or prequel, the actor died. So now you can't do anything. And then by the time they did the prequel with his son, it was way too late. And you might say, well, who cares about reruns? We're now living in the land of streaming, where everything remains there, so you never have to miss having it. Well, guess what? Absence makes the heart grow fonder. When it is always there, it has no value, especially if it's not a show you love. So you see that Netflix now is trying to restructure the old ways of having windows in terms of its arrangement with many of its partners. It's gone back to doing primarily licensing instead of creating its own shows. The advantage of Netflix doing licensing is A, the companies that are making the programs and the movies and all of that now can have a bite of the apple in terms of its afterlife. Now, it's sad that they got rid of physical media so thoroughly that you don't have that window anymore. There was no reason to kill it. Physical media was dying, but they made it almost an embarrassment to admit you were still doing physical media, which was a mistake, because physical media was always a good source of additional revenue, even though DVD had reached, and Blu-ray and all that, had reached the point where all you were really looking for is new titles coming out, because all of the great older library titles were already available. Well, when you got rid of physical media, you lost even that ability. And as we've seen, physical media has hung on. Sony did not license all of the Disney and 20th Century Fox titles because they felt sorry for Disney for spending so much money on 20th Century Fox, right? And then doing nothing with that asset, or basically nothing with that. That was a $70 billion payday. And what have they done with it, right? They've done jack with it, really, all things considered. And certainly not $70 billion worth of an investment. So them doing that is because Sony knows that physical media is still big in the Far East. And I know America is very America-centric and thinks, well, that's there, who cares? Except that that's an enormous market that is driving a big chunk of even current CD sales, because Asians tend to like to own something. They don't trust something that can be taken away or changed. You want to have something that's the solid artifact, not a French connection. Oh, let's cut out these couple of lines of dialogue because they're going to bother people today. No, you don't want that to happen. But we'll see what happens. I mean, I don't think physical media can stage a comeback in the US, but it is a nice niche the same way vinyl is. But that was another source of revenue. That's more money that people who got union residuals are not getting. So you don't have enough episodes. You don't have an ability to have something move through multiple windows. So even though the Writers Guild was able to achieve a very, very nice increase in your basic pay when you do a show, because now you're going to do I think it's a 10-year buyout for the foreign market, which is nice, except for one problem. There isn't a rerun structure for a lot of these few episode shows. So therefore, that first check where you get it all at once is all you'll ever get. There isn't going to be revenue from something you did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, coming in, even if it's in dribs and drabs. That's not going to happen with most of those kinds of shows. And moreover, there was the problem with minimal staffing. Now, this was a big thing that the Writers Guild organizing board, the negotiating board, had made, saying that, oh, look at what we've done here. We now have a minimum number of people you have in a writer's room. However, we all know that in times of economic tightness, that unless you're at the very, very tippy top, the very top of the entertainment industry, you're not going to have negotiating power. So let's say that you're a story editor right now, which is a pretty high up job in the Writers Guild, and you come up with a new show, and you fortunately get it on a network where you have more than 13 episode commitment. You still don't have the size of a writing staff you used to have. Old network shows used to have staffs that were 12 plus people. You'd have your showrunners, you'd have your quote unquote baby writers who would be there as part of the writing staff and all of that. Well, now you're going to have three people who are must hires, no matter how few episodes you have, which is for the first six, you've got three must hires. And that is the showrunner, or two if there's two showrunners, and then one other high level writer, which would be a story editor. Not below that, not a staff writer. Once you go up to, I believe, 9 episodes, you can have one. And then once you go over 13 episodes, you can have two. And that's it. Again, you're Dick Wolf. You do Law and Order. You want 40 people on your staff, knock yourself out. But if you're not that, that's all the writers you're going to have. How many writers who were coming in are now not going to have that opportunity to be on staff? Because 5 to 6 writers is not 12. And so those opportunities have become limited. Now, the other thing, the diversity minimums, that's going to go away because clearly that's completely against the law. So you cannot discriminate one way or another. It's just, you don't do that. And as we've seen with Disney's attempt to say it's First Amendment for them to discriminate against people, no, it isn't. So that's gone. But you're still having a lot of writers who have had their careers derailed because of the length of the strike, because of the lack of a lot of episodes, and now because of the minimization. And remember, this is coming on the heels of a couple of years ago when the Writers Guild succeeded in getting rid of packaging. Now, I have gotten into disagreements with people who were writers about the whole issues of agency packaging. And let me give you the perception of someone who was management. So take it with a grain of salt. If you're a complete union person, be aware that that's my perspective, where I'm coming from. I hated packaging because I saw what packaging did to a lot of the independent film production companies. Because what was happening, and part of the reason the independent film world collapsed, was the agencies were getting a lot of power with packaging. What packaging meant was they would put together several elements of a project. And that part was okay, because a lot of the agencies, especially the big ones, could put together very substantial packages with a writer, a director, and maybe a key actor, maybe even some below the line people. And for that, they would get a percentage of the budget and a percentage of net profits for a feature film and a share of rerun revenues for TV shows. So agencies were getting bigger and bigger and bigger because of that. They were getting more and more and more money. This was great for writers in a way because they weren't having to pay the agent the 10%. But what I don't think a lot of writers realized, that while this was happening, an agency was pretty much making anywhere from a quarter to a half of what that writer was making per episode, with all of these incentives they had, with the gross points percentage of the revenues that would be coming in. So actually, it behooved the agencies to only focus on the biggest writers and actors. And that meant that a lot of times, and we're never supposed to say this, but trust me, this was common practice. What an agency, the powerful ones, would do is they would see someone from a mid-sized agency who was promising and who might have competed against one of their other talents. And so they would woo that person to come and join their bigger agency. But it wasn't because they wanted to make that person's career bigger. They wanted to block that person's career. They wanted to block their forward momentum. And so they would appear on writers' lists that would go to the networks, would go to the studios as potentials, but they would be near the bottom of the list. Not only that, but in many instances, they would give them lower budget projects that didn't have quite the profile. And if they happened to break out, then hey, maybe then that person would become the big talent, and the person who was the big talent would now not be as big, and they would be kicked out the same way. They would be suddenly reduced. But it was very much that. Where this hurt independent motion picture companies, the low budget companies. This is where I started my career, even before I got into Fremantle, Scotty Brothers, and all that. What was happening was that you would have a project sent to a company, and it would often have a date where you had to enter a bidding war for it. And that sounds like, oh, well, then everyone's going to make a lot of money, right? Wrong, because the problem with a bidding war was that, let me tell you an infamous case. There was a script that went around called The Ticking Man. And what it was about a guy who had a bomb strapped to him. And you had government agents involved with it and all of that. And they had X amount of time to pay a ransom, or this guy was going to blow up. So, and it had, I think, Bruce Willis attached to it. So it made the rounds, and people had until noon to make an offer for the package. And what that offer included was not only a promise of budget, but it also included all of the other fringes that might come along with that. And you only had 3 hours from the time the package was sent out in the morning. Okay, now it'd be emailed, but then it was delivered. And it had an alarm clock on it that would go off. And if the alarm clock went off and you hadn't submitted your offer, you couldn't submit it after that point. And this was happening constantly. And all of these packages had what were called pay or play deals. And that meant that if you did not adhere to the schedule and the terms that you put down there, or you had to delay for some reason and eventually cancel, you had to pay a big percentage of that salary to everybody who was involved in that package. Can we say that I saw Vestron, I saw Kings Road, I saw Orion, I saw Carolco, and a couple of other companies all go out of business? Because as they were increasing the size of their companies with the big foreign sales that were coming in, especially from Japan, and they were putting a lot of stuff into the pipeline, they were also paying massive kill fees. So let's say that you got a package for a movie that was going to cost, this was almost 40 years ago. So remember, it's a lot of, or 30 to 40 years ago. So the numbers aren't going to mean as much as they would today. But let's say that you put 50 million down and then you killed the project. You might have just said goodbye to $10 million, between $5 and $10 million that was gone. How many of those could you do a year with projects that were killed? How about if you're doing one of these things and you have a nightmare production because the lead actor you contracted to it has another project coming up right behind it, so you end up having to shoot them out fast, and so now you have a chaotic schedule, and that means you're going to have a chaotic budget that's going to go out of control at some point. And then you might end up with a bad movie, and you can't get that actor back to do reshoots. So this was a very, very bad situation. So from a producer's and a low-budget filmmaker's standpoint, packaging was terrible. Now, for writers, packaging was great if you were in that club of people who were constantly hired, because you would get hired at a top rate. Why? Because the agency had a reason to pay you a lot, because that increased the budget. And because they were paid a percentage of the budget, that meant they would get more money from that. So it was really something that made the agencies very big and very controlling, because the industry always goes through different sectors of the industry having unlimited power. And it always falls apart, and it's always disgusting when it happens because it blows up in a bad way. You've had times when only the lawyers have hegemony. You have a time when it's only the independent producers. You have other times when it's agents and managers. You have other times when it's stars who are driving everything. Stars are the ones that are the least problematic, by the way. I know it sounds like they'd be the worst, but no, they're actually the least problematic. The worst are when you have lawyers or agents in control, simply because it becomes a matter of billable hours and dollars and cents and complications and paperwork snafus that can run on forever. So you already lost a lot of writers from that, because the Writers Guild at their peak in their power with this had convinced a lot of their rank and file that they had to fire their agents and managers unless the agents and managers agreed to do away with packaging. And that's exactly what happened. Well, guess what? A lot of these agents and managers, once they couldn't do packaging anymore, didn't have the revenues coming in. So they had to start firing agents. And also, they didn't need as many talent anymore because they weren't pulling people off the market to stop from being competitive. So a lot of people were never able to get another agent after that. Now you add this strike. You add this strike where the number of people who are hired for every show has been decreased. You've created a situation where a baby writer cannot write an original series, at least in the US, because if you're writing an original series and it's less than the and it's 6 episodes or less, you don't have to hire a baby writer. And if that minimum has become a maximum, that means you have lost control of your project. Even if everyone loves it, it's going to go to the showrunner, and you're not going to be able to be hired on. Yes, you'll get a created by credit. So what? You're not going to get the opportunity that you thought that you were. So now that we have seen that they have succeeded in shutting down the town, giving the studios, because now remember, we had both agents, we had both unions shut the industry down. Since that happened, it gave the industry time to catch up and take a breather and look at the stuff they had in their pipeline. Look at what was happening in the market. Look at what wasn't happening in the market. We weren't having 400 million people per service. We were having maybe 400 people total in the whole market. And 60% of those are involved one way or another with Netflix projects. So that means a lot of the other companies are now in trouble. Look at what has happened with Apple TV. Notice that they have pulled way back on their original content because they cannot have an adequate number of subscribers to support the vast amount of money they have going out. They are not in the business of burning money for art. They aren't. No matter what people say at cocktail parties and at press releases, if you don't make money, you stop doing it. I am assuming that Apple is going to become like Netflix and get much more in the business of licensing, which will be good news for independent production companies, lower budget production companies. No one's going to be spending the crazy money they were spending on something like The Acolyte. I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to justify spending $25 to $30 million an episode for a half-hour episode. It's ridiculous. So you're going to see a cutting back on that. That's where the advantage is for newbie writers. Let it never be said that when the entertainment industry is doing well, that it's a great time to get in above the line. It's actually the worst time, because when everything is going well, people hire their friends. They hire people who are politically expedient for them for their future careers. They hire the friends of the agents they're working with. All of that BS happens. They hire stars' kids or other executives' kids. because again, it's building up a favor bank. It's great for below the line, the crafts, the cinematographers, the editors, the sound people, the production designers, but it's not good for above the line because newbies can't break in. When the industry is in a disaster, that's when they're going to look for fire in a bottle, which is going to include non-union writers. It's going to include non-union actors because they will work for less. Trust me, Hallmark and Lifetime and USA and all of these other cable outlets, linear cable outlets, have not gone broke doing Christmas movies and romances and woman in jeopardy stories that cost less than $1 million each to make. And you're going to see a lot of those people being given different opportunities in the big game because they know how to do something efficiently, get it done, and have it look competent. So that will be the way that newer people will get in. This has been a repeating cycle throughout Hollywood's history. So this isn't new. I've been through 4 of these turnarounds in my career. So they happen about every 10 years. And we're just in another one right now. So good luck, because it's going to look very bad for a short period of time. But certainly when you look at the success that we've been having in movies that didn't comport to agency packages, to favor banks, to ESG checkbox movies, they've done very well, haven't they? Barbie, Oppenheimer. And now, of course, we have Deadpool and Wolverine, which I just saw today, by the way. And I've got to tell you, at 127 minutes, it was one of the first movies I've seen in quite a while where I didn't say, wow, why is that movie so long? It's a little bit longer than maybe would have been ideal, but not to the point where there was any moment when I thought, wow, this is moving too slow. It had a great sense of humor about itself. It did not feel like a lecture that was coming down the pike. So between that and Inside Out 2, I have to say, I'm extremely bullish of where the industry is going, to say nothing of the fact that the low budget Baby Reindeer was one of the better series that I've seen in a long time. So I do think the industry is getting ready to come back. It just needed to hit a reset. So fasten your seatbelt. It's going to be a bumpy night for a minute. But I think another renaissance is on its way.
You like potatoes, and I like potatoes. You like tomatoes, and I like tomato. Potatoes, potato, tomato, tomato. Oh, let's call the whole thing off.